So last weekend just wrapped up the Tour de France. It's something that I always make it a point to watch every year. I'm kind of into professional cycling. It's a thing. I don't know if you can see my bike back there. Ever since I was a kid, though, we started watching the Tour de France. I remember watching it with my dad when Lance Armstrong won the first of his 7 Tours de France and when he began that cycle of dominance. And once he started winning and people looked at his story, I mean, it's hard not to feel good about it and to want the guy to win and to appreciate it. I mean, as an American, I mean, it's a sport that Americans aren't typically very dominant in. And here was an American who was the most dominant of anyone in the world. But even beyond that, I mean, he's a guy who had some success early on in his career. He was a world champion, among other things. And then he contracted cancer, the surgery, the chemo, just hitting rock bottom. And most people would have said, there's no way he can ever race again. But then for him to battle back from that, and not just to battle back to race, but to battle back to win at the very highest level. And then even beyond that, to be dominant at the highest level for so long. I mean, it's an incredible story. In some ways, it's like the quintessential American story, something that we can all look to and say, yeah, that's what it means, right? To just be able to scrap and to work hard, and you can climb your way up to the top. But of course, as soon as he began to have success, the allegations started to come that he couldn't be doing this clean, that he was using performance-enhancing drugs, that he was doping. And of course, he vehemently denied them, sometimes in maybe some not so good ways, right? With lawsuits and with even fiercer allegations in return. Eventually, the amount of evidence piled up so high that he had to confess to Oprah, of all people, because why not? Who doesn't love Oprah? So he confessed to Oprah that he had used performance-enhancing drugs, he had doped, and then, of course, the subsequent outrage that followed was pretty strong. I mean, he's stripped of his titles, he was sued back, I mean, lawsuits by all of his sponsors to recoup their money. I mean, it was a fiasco. And of course, a lot of people then just kind of gave up and quit on cycling, who had come to appreciate Lance Armstrong. They quit on him. He was canceled before canceling people was cool in some ways, and not without reason, right? Because he'd done some bad stuff. But what I think we found with the Lance Armstrong story is this idea that we want our heroes to be perfect, don't we? I mean, who doesn't? We want the people that we look up to and who are successful to be perfect in every respect. Like, of course, they might be very near perfection as an athlete, but we want like a moral perfection to go with it. The reality is that Lance Armstrong, the same guy who started the Livestrong Foundation and gave hope and financial assistance and resources to millions of folks going through cancer treatments and cancer survivors, and built this incredible community, is also the guy who cheated and who doped. But everyone else was doing it too, but he still did something wrong, right? And so it's this very complicated kind of web of what's going on in a person. And that's hard for a lot of us because we have in us this deep longing for a perfect, morally upright kind of hero. Well, more on that later. But the problem is, like Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, that the dividing line between good and evil cuts through every human heart. And now, we can sometimes acknowledge that when it's about ourselves, sometimes. But when it's about the heroes, we sometimes have a difficult time with it. But in the words of every Southern grandpa ever, he puts on his pants one leg at a time, just like the rest of us. Everyone's just a person. And in many respects, just a very ordinary person. I mean, more ordinary than we'd care to admit. And all this is important because what we're looking at today is a story of Samson. So as we've been going through this series in the book of Judges that we're calling Living in a Post-Wilderness World. And the reason we're calling it that is because we're looking at what it's like to live in a normal world once we come out of this sort of wilderness experience. I think there's some parallels to the world that we find ourselves in today. And so we come to Judges 13 through 16, which is the story of Samson. I think if a lot of people would go to the book of Judges and they were to pull out a story about one of the judges, Samson is probably the one who gets pulled out the most. But as we'll find out, Samson is a really complicated figure. I don't know if you can call him a hero. I mean, maybe in the end you can call him a hero, but there's a lot in his story that is good and bad. Like any kind of hero who's just an ordinary, normal person. But I hope that what we see in the story of Samson is how we can live with faithfulness in God's kingdom, no matter what our circumstances may be, and even with all the complications that come in the course of normal, ordinary, average human life, which is, of course, all of us have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through the story itself, and then I'm going to have some points of application at the end that I think are very helpful and hopefully very instructive for all of us. So, story of Samson. If you want to read this, you can go Judges 13 through 16 and follow along, but this is where we find ourselves at the outset. So Israel had been oppressed by the Philistines for about 40 years. So the Philistines lived along the Mediterranean coast in what's today Israel. Israel itself, that land along the Mediterranean Sea, west of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. So that's the region we're talking about. The Philistines had taken administrative and military control of Israel and had been ruling for about 40 years. And then this is what we hear. It says, the angel of the Lord appeared to this woman and said to her, "You are barren and childless, but you are going to become pregnant and give birth to a son. Now see to it that you drink no wine or other fermented drink, and that you do not eat anything unclean. You will become pregnant and have a son whose head is never to be touched by a razor, because the boy is to be a Nazirite, dedicated to God from the womb. He will take the lead in delivering Israel from the hands of the Philistines." And so we see here is that in the midst of this complex geopolitical situation, God comes to a husband and a wife. Specifically, he comes to the wife first and then later to the husband, and he gives them this sort of instruction. Says that you're going to give birth to a son. I know that you had previously been barren and unable to get pregnant, childless, but you will give birth to a son, and he's to be dedicated as a Nazirite from the womb, which that sounds kind of weird. Can I just be honest? Like when we read that stuff, it sounds kind of bizarre. Like what's with the old not eating grape stuff and drinking wine and not shaving his head? I mean, that's kind of odd. But what specifically we're talking about here is something that we find in Numbers 6. So the first 5 books of the Bible are considered the Torah, the instruction of the Lord, that God gave to his people at the very beginning. It's a kind of form as his covenant people. And so in the book of Numbers, number 6, we hear about someone who's dedicated in making a Nazirite vow. Now, the word Nazirite comes from the Hebrew word netzer. It means to be set apart. So here's someone who would be specifically set apart to God's service. When you read it in number 6, it gives the sense of it being more of a temporary kind of thing, but Samson, we're told here, is going to be a Nazirite from the womb. Specifically, a Nazirite is someone who goes through a particular series of commitments and vows in order to be specially dedicated to God. There are a few different things that entails. It meant no grape products, period. So no grapes, no grapevines, no wine, consequently. It meant things like no unclean foods, no haircuts, and no touching of corpses. In other words, this individual was to be completely clean within like the legal Jewish sense of cleanliness, which included food laws, various purity laws. You get the idea, right? So if you want to read more about that, you can look at number 6. But just the idea is that Samson is someone who's been set apart from the womb, before he was even born, to be dedicated to God, to fulfill a certain kind of purpose that God would have for him. This is then what we're told, that the woman gave birth to a boy and named him Samson. He grew up and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him while he was in Mahanadan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. So this is in northwest of Jerusalem is where we're looking at, if you're looking at a map, which you may not be. But what we hear is that as Samson grows up, the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him. I think that's important just for us to kind of pause and reflect on for a second, which is that we like to try to have these linear kind of moments, right? Where it's like someone is in and someone's out. You with me? But I think the way that God often works in people's lives is there's this kind of stirring that happens in us, and maybe we move from a 0 up to like a 20 to a 50 to a 70 on a scale of 0 to 100. You know what I mean? It's this kind of often a very slow, gradual process. Not that there's not moments, marked moments of transformation. Not that there's these moments where you can say, yes, something changed at that specific point in time, because God, of course, does that. Because God, of course, can do whatever he pleases, right? It'd be by very nature God. If he couldn't do it, then he wouldn't be very God, would he? God can do whatever he pleases. And yet, very often, he chooses to work in us gradually so that I think we can become the kind of people who can receive his greater work for us. It's a process, a transformation process. So Samson grows up, and he takes up residence in this area that's known in Israel as the Shephelah. It's like hill country in kind of central Israel, which is this, in many ways, it is symbolic of this place in which Samson will find himself. Right? The Shephelah essentially separates the coast from the desert in Israel. The coast, which was controlled by the Philistines, the desert, which was properly the homeland of the people of Israel. So the Shephelah is this kind of rolling hill country in the middle. As Samson grows up, presumably keeping the Nazirite vows, apparently doing this well, though there's not really any discussion of this in the text. There's not really any much commentary on what's going on in his life in his early years. But he grows up, presumably as a Nazirite. And interestingly, it's really our only explicit statement of someone in the Old or New Testament who takes Nazirite vows. There's definitely a lot of allusions to it, other people doing it. There's suggestions that other people are going through that process. Samuel comes to mind. We see the Apostle Paul going through some similar experiences in his journeys in the book of Acts. But Samson is the only figure who is explicitly named as someone who is taking a Nazirite vow, who becomes an important and prominent figure in the biblical story. His story properly begins in this way. It says that Samson went down to Timnah one day, and he saw there a young Philistine woman. It's classic boy meets girl story. You know, it's setting us up for the great moment. Except, of course, the problem is that Samson was to be the one who would deliver Israel from the Philistines. Part of the problem for Israel over and over and over again was that they would become politically and religiously intertwined with these other parties and then become like those other nations. Whereas Israel was supposed to be the transformative presence. Israel was supposed to be the one who would positively influence the people around them. It's just like this, right? Like, you ever know someone who fell into a group of friends and they got, you know, they hanging around a bad crowd and it rubbed off on them, right? And then you're like, wow, what happened? Well, they're hanging around a bad crowd, right? Whereas Israel was supposed to be the one who went into the group of friends and made everybody better, lifted them up, exalted them, brought them up higher, closer to be like God. Whereas in reality, what happened is they kind of got dragged back down to the lowest common denominator. It's happened over and over and over again. And so we're told that Samson goes down to the village of Timnah and he sees a young Philistine woman. And he decides that this young Philistine woman is someone that he wants to marry. So he tells his parents, I'm going to marry this woman. I want you to get her for me. Because, you know, he couldn't just propose, right? Or ask her out on dinner first. Like, that would maybe be a better first step. But it's the ancient world. Things worked a little differently. His parents naturally disagree because she's a Philistine. Because she is not a follower of the Lord, the one true God, because her family are historic enemies with Israel. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why they disagree. Samson insists, and so ultimately they say, okay, we'll do it. Samson returns back to Timnah, presumably just to go talk with the love of his life, whose name we don't actually find out in this story, which is kind of interesting. He goes back down to Timnah, and on the way, he's attacked by a lion, which is like a pretty bad day, right? But Samson, we're told, of course, being a Nazirite, being someone who's dedicated to God from birth, we know that he is going to have this kind of destiny of delivering the people of Israel from the Philistines. What we don't know is that along the way, there's going to be some pretty wild stuff happening. So he's going back to Timnah, right, to pick up his girl, to try to get her to become his fiancée. He's attacked by a lion. It says this: the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, and he's endowed with this kind of supernatural strength in this moment, and he kills the lion with his bare hands, which is fairly impressive. I mean, lions are pretty big. I don't know if you've seen one. I don't think I'd want to fight one with my bare hands. I don't think I'd survive, frankly. But Samson, we're told, kills a lion with his bare hands and just leaves it there. Like, just leaves it laying in the road. Goes on to chat up his girl, which he does, and it says he pretty much enjoyed it. So later we're told he goes back home. He comes back to come marry this woman, right? He's gonna marry her, and so this is, months have passed. And as he's walking by where he was attacked by this lion, the corpse is still laying there by the side of the road. And as he goes by it, he sees that a swarm of bees have made a hive within the corpse, the decomposing corpse of this lion. Samson goes in. I guess he thought, like, why not have a snack? He goes in and grabs some honey, and then continues on his journey, brings some for his family along the way, some lion corpse honey, and brings some to his family, and continues on with his journey. I mean, so much for the whole, like, Nazirite vow, not touching a corpse kind of thing, like unclean animal. I mean, whatever. I don't know, right? So we see already there's some things within Samson's story that are a little bit, maybe there's some stuff going on here, It's a little bit odd. So we hear that once he gets down to Timnah, they prepare to have the wedding feast, which was customary in this culture. At the wedding feast, it was also customary for the bride's family to assign some men, some escorts, some groomsmen to the groom. To basically keep watch over him, to make sure he doesn't do anything crazy, make sure he doesn't run off, all sorts of things, right? So they assigned 30 men to Samson, which seems like a high number. It historically would probably have been a lot. But so Samson's hanging out with, his new family, or soon-to-be family, and I guess at some point they just got bored, like people do. And usually when a bunch of young men are sitting around and they get bored, that's when not the best decisions are made. So they don't make the best decisions. Samson decides, like, hey, let's have a little wager. I bet you 30 suits that you can't guess my riddle. They say, all right, Samson, game on. What's your riddle? And then he tells them this kind of weird riddle about, like, getting honey from this lion corpse. Like, it's just kind of odd, right? Of course, they can't guess the riddle, and days go by. Of course, keep in mind, wedding feasts in the ancient world is about a week-long process, and so as it comes to the end of the week, his fiancée comes to him and says, how could you do this to me and my family? I mean, you're disgracing us and dishonoring us. You won't even tell me what the answer to the riddle is? Your beloved wife, you won't tell me? I mean, shame on you. You must hate me. And then she gives him this massive guilt trip. And Samson, of course, then says, okay, I'll tell you. He tells her the answer to the riddle. Well, then she goes and tells her family, who then come back to Samson and tell him the answer to his riddle, which then makes him profoundly upset because he knows that his Philistine wife betrayed him to her family and now his family, and he owes them 30 suits, like a suit for each dude. So in response to this, what Samson then does, he goes up to the city, the Philistine city of Ashkelon. There were 5 main Philistine cities along the coast. They were heavily fortified cities. He goes to the city of Ashkelon. I don't know when, maybe in the middle of the night. I don't know. We're just told he goes in the city, beats up 30 dudes, kills 30 dudes, takes their clothes, takes their money, goes back to his Philistine family and said, here's your pay. Now leave me alone. And then he goes back home and abandons his fiancée and the rest of his family, right? Like, what is going on here? It's a bit odd, right? If we can just be honest, it's kind of a weird situation. Months later, we're told that Samson comes back to reclaim his bride. I don't know exactly what was going on in his mind here, but it was not uncommon in the ancient world that if there was some kind of break in the engagement, that then the parent of the bride would give the bride to someone else. I mean, that's part of why there were 30 guys there, right? You pick one, that'll be your husband. So Samson goes back to consummate the marriage with his wife that he was never able to do. So he comes up to the door, he says, knock, knock, who's there? Samson. Samson who? Samson, I'm come to sleep with my wife, your daughter, which is maybe not the best line of introduction, but that's what Samson does. The dad says, well, she's not here right now because I gave her to someone else. May I take a message? Also, have you seen her sister? She's better looking, don't you think? Which is, I mean, that's what he does. So then Samson, of course, is then not super happy. As we've maybe seen, he's got perhaps a bit of a temper, maybe, is a good way to put it. This is what the text says. It says that Samson went out and caught 300 jackals. Some texts say foxes. That word could also be translated jackals. Not that it's super relevant whether it's a jackal or a fox, but like maybe pragmatically, I feel like jackals are pack animals. It may be easier to catch 300 jackals than 300 individual foxes. I don't know. It's not really material, but just something to think about. Could be translated either way. He goes out and catches 300 jackals, and he ties them tail to tail in pairs, which is quite the sight, you know. He then fastened a torch to every pair of tails, so tied, a torch in between their legs, in the tails, tied a torch to every pair of tails, lit the torches, and then let the jackals loose in the standing grain of the Philistines. Moments before, we've been told that it was approaching the harvest time. So they've been growing crops for, however many months. It was the time of the harvest. This was their livelihood, right? And it was so late in the season, they couldn't really start over. And then Samson releases these like jackal torches into these fields of all their crops. We're told that along with their vineyards and their olive groves, and burns them all to the ground, which is maybe like, I don't know, is that necessarily fair or a proportionate response? It seems a bit extreme. The Philistines who lived in this area then were naturally upset. They asked, who did this and essentially ruined our livelihood for the remainder of the year? To which the people then said, Samson, the Timnite's son-in-law, which isn't technically true. I mean, it sort of is, but sort of not. That's a complicated relationship to call him son-in-law, in my opinion. So Samson, the Timnite's son-in-law, because his wife was given to his companion, one of the other guys. So the Philistines, in retaliatory response to Samson's retaliatory response, go up and burn the woman and her father to death. Which, Samson then hears about. And if you thought Samson was mad because the dad gave away his wife, imagine how he's going to feel when the Philistines burned her alive. Well, you could have guessed it, right? He's a little upset. And so what Samson does, we're told, is he goes and just slays a bunch of dudes. And then he runs off, right, and hides in a cave up in the Shephelah, the hill country outside in the ancestral territory of the land of Judah. 3,000 soldiers from the tribe of Judah go up to this cave where Samson's hiding. They're like, yo, Samson, the Philistines are ruling us right now. I don't think you should really be doing what you're doing. Can we convince you to turn yourself in? He said, I'll turn myself in as long as you promise not to be the ones who kill me. They say, okay, Samson, you're an Israelite. We won't kill you. We'll just hand you over to the Philistines. So that's what they do. They tie him up. They hand him over to the Philistines. And when he's presented before the Philistine army, you know what old Samson does, right? He just busts out the ropes, like kind of supernatural strength, busts out of the ropes, grabs the jawbone of a donkey, like a dead donkey, a jawbone laying there on the ground, and proceeds to kill 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. Which, man, what a story that is. And, at one level, I think we have to take one more quick pause and consider that this is the kind of stuff that happens when you try to get revenge. When someone wrongs you and you return evil for evil, it's just this cycle that just keeps on going. And when does it stop? When does it stop? Like it keeps escalating further and further and further, all along the way. Which is why which is the context specifically that Jesus is talking about when he says turn the other cheek. This is that in the Sermon on the Mount, you go look in Matthew 5 and 6 when Jesus is talking about these kind of ideas. He says, when someone wrongs you, when someone hits you on one side of your face, offer them the other cheek also. When someone takes a cloak from you, offer them the other one also. His point is that if you return good for evil, you break this cycle of violence. It's the only way it happens. Sometimes people use that to justify inaction in situations and say, well, I'm just turning the other cheek. Jesus is specifically meaning that you need to return not just passivity in the face of evil and injustice, but return good in the face of evil and injustice, because that is the only way that the cycle of violence is broken. Quick pause. Returning to Samson's story. Later on, we're told, after dude just been slaying thousands of Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey, he goes back to the city of Gaza, so another one of the fortified cities of the Philistines. And as he goes into the town, he saw a prostitute there. And I guess she looked good to him, and he decided that he would sleep with her, which is what he then does. And then while he's there in the middle of the night, he catches wind that the Philistines are plotting to take him. Understandably so, because the last time they saw him, he was killing thousands of them with the jawbone of a donkey, right? It makes sense. He catches wind of this, he leaves and goes to their city gates at the front of the city. The city gate was very important, right? Remember, these were heavily fortified cities. He goes to the city gate and just like rips them up and then takes them and deposits them on a hill, and then goes on his way. And that's the end of weird chapter 2 of Samson's story. We then move into weird chapter 3 of Samson's particular tale, which is that sometime later on, we're told that he falls in love with another Philistine woman, and this time we get her name, which is interesting. He falls in love with another Philistine woman named Delilah. Once the Philistine leaders catch wind that Samson has once again, for the third time in our story, in case you're not keeping track, 3 times now he's fallen in love with a Philistine woman, and which seems to be a problem because Israel and Philistine are at war, and Samson seems to be caught right in the middle of this over and over and over again. He falls in love with Delilah. The Philistine leaders catch wind of this, and then they come to Delilah and say, okay, try to figure out, like, what's the secret, right? Like, how is this dude so strong? Like, we don't understand. Tell us how he's so strong, figure out the secret, and then we'll handsomely reward you when we can take him prisoner. To which Delilah then proceeds to try to get the secret out of Samson. To Samson's credit, sort of, he does resist for a while, but eventually she just keeps laying the guilt trip on him, manipulating, deceiving, and Samson eventually then gives in. And this is what he tells her. It says, he told her everything. No razor, quote, has ever touched my head or been used on my head, he said, because I have been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man. Which is another important point, right? That Samson, see, it's not really just the hair, right? The hair is a symbol. The hair is a symbol. And the symbol is that Samson's strength comes from his relationship to God. Samson's strength comes specifically from his dedication to God from the womb, right? Which is kind of the way this is being built out. And that the hair becomes then a symbol of his commitment to the Lord. And that if that hair were cut, that he would then lose his strength. In other words, right, staying with the analogy here, if the vow were broken, if his relationship with God were cut off, then so would his strength be cut off. So would this symbolic nature. So you see where this is going, right? Only when that hair would be cut off, then, or that relationship severed, would Samson be able to be subdued. And so that night, Delilah goes and tells the Philistines, say, hey, I figured out the secret. It's his hair. Cut his hair. She puts him, pets him, soothes him, puts him to sleep by the fire, calls in the guys, cut his hair, and then they wrap him up and take him as a prisoner. This is specifically what we're told, though. It says, then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, ouch, and then took him down to Gaza. Which, they were probably still a little bitter about the whole gate incident from before. It says, binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding grain in the prison. But the hair on his head began to grow again. after it had been shaved. So remember, if the hair is symbolic of his commitment and his vow and his allegiance to God, and it would seemingly have been that he was cut off and his strength was gone, well, it begins to regrow while he's in prison. More on that in a minute, but what I will say now is just, no matter how cut off you feel, and no matter how far away from God's presence you think you might be, and no matter how much you think you've done to put a barrier between yourself and God, it only takes just a little bit, right? That hair begins to grow, right? The relationship, the Spirit of the Lord begins to stir, and God's always reaching out and always calling you back home to Him. So Samson's in prison. Things look pretty bleak, pretty grim. And while he's in prison, at some point, the Philistines are having a party in the temple of their god, and they decide that it would be really fun to make a certain sport out of this now blind, previously heroic figure for the Israelites, by tormenting him and kind of making him like perform in front of everyone in the temple. So they bring him out of the temple. It's crowded with Philistines, about 3,000 people, and they're all mocking him and yelling at him and spitting on him and humiliating him. And then this is what we're told. It says, "Then," quote, "Samson prayed to the Lord, 'Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes.'" Which I do want to make one comment here, is that this is the first time in Samson's story that we are specifically told that Samson prayed to the Lord. Isn't that interesting? Presumably, he's prayed before, but this is the first time that we have the words of Samson's prayer. And I think that's important, and important for us to pay attention to, is that here in this place, when Samson was at his lowest point, at the very bottom of the pit, that's when perhaps he truly realized, and he was at his absolute weakest, maybe that's when he truly realized really where his strength came from, that really it came from God, and that really he needed him. And that Samson, for as strong as he wasn't meant to do it alone. I mean, none of us are. We all need God in our lives, and we all need that kind of power that only He can give. So Samson concludes this prayer, and this is what he says. He says, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all his might against the 2 pillars of the temple, apparently, arms with the party. He pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people of the Philistines who were in it. It says, quote, "He killed many more when he died than while he lived. And thus Israel was delivered from the hands of the Philistines. And they lived happily ever after for a little bit until we get to next week and we see what other mess they get themselves into." So as we reach the end of Samson's story, I mean, you kind of take a step back and you say, whew, man, that was something, that's for sure. What do we do with it? What do we do with Samson in general? I mean, he demonstrates at the end this kind of remarkable faith and heroic sacrifice, but so much of his story is intermingled with these moments of greatness and these moments of incredible weakness and of scandal and just absurd kind of temperamental behavior. So what do we do with Samson? There's 4 things I just want us to think about. This isn't exhaustive, but it's just 4 things to consider. The first one is this, that in some sense, right, Samson is representative of the entire nation of Israel. Think about it, right? Samson is someone who's been dedicated as a Nazirite, dedicated from birth for a specific purpose of delivering the people of Israel from oppression at the hands of the Philistines. Israel, from the beginning, in the biblical story, right, from Genesis, where God says to Abraham, he says, "Your descendants will be a blessing to all the peoples of the earth. I will bless them and multiply them and make them fruitful, that they will be a blessing to all the nations on the earth." So in some ways, what we see is that Samson is this representative of Israel, a people who have been dedicated to the Lord from before they were born, and who often fall short of that and have these incredible moments of faith and of activity and mission in the world, but also have this kind of proclivity to be drawn towards foreign wives, like Samson seems to have. Because throughout the story of Israel, throughout the entire Old Testament, one of the problems that Israel keeps running back into is that they would, as the prophets would often say, they would prostitute themselves to foreign gods, right? Where they would, for a variety of reasons, right? Political expediency, just financial sense, just whatever the reason may have been, they would often go and worship the local deities around them and abandon their commitment to the Lord. Samson becomes then this kind of representative microcosm of Israel, playing out in this kind of weird place, right? Where Samson here is in this intermediary place between the wilderness, the desert, literally, in the Jewish mind, the wilderness and the desert are synonymous. So between the desert and between the kind of Gentile pagan coastline, right? This is the place in which Samson finds himself in the Shephelah. And I think the interesting point for all of us is that very often that's where we find ourselves, right? As followers of Jesus, in this place between a world that doesn't really believe in Jesus and who he is and in his kingdom, and between this kind of desert on the other hand. And we're kind of in the middle, right? And honestly, that's the place we want to be. We want to be in the middle. We don't want to be all the way over here in this kind of desert space, but we don't want to be all the way over here living this pagan life in these pagan cities. We want to be in this place, being a transformative presence wherever we are. So Samson is representative of Israel in many ways in that regard, and I think also very instructive for us. When you just look at Samson's life and you see how often he gets sucked into various things over here, right, in the kind of pagan culture. And of course, the old rabbis, this brings us to application point number 2, right? The old rabbis would say the problem is Samson's eyes. Samson's eyes. You see, the people of Israel were always meant to be, as the old rabbis put it, a people of the ears, right? Whereas the pagans, the Gentiles, were a people of the eyes. That they primarily acted based upon what they saw. So the Gentile cities were extravagant, beautiful cities. They put a lot of emphasis on architecture and all sorts of things like that, right? Where they were a people of the eyes, a lot of visual sensory activity. Whereas the people of Israel were a people of the ears, right? Where they were to be a people who heard the word of the Lord, right? So in Deuteronomy 6, the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord alone. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, and all your strength. They were to be a people of the ears who heard what God was saying and who then put it into practice in their lives. And so when you look at Samson's life, the problem comes up for Samson 3 times, right? Where he sees a beautiful Philistine woman and then gets just drawn off into this kind of wild misadventure that doesn't seem to end well for him. 3 times this happens, the first one with his wife in Timnah, and then the prostitute in Gaza, and then Delilah. 3 times he sees a Philistine woman and is then drawn towards this life of kind of sin and wickedness, right? Whereas what happens at the very end of the story, when he's finally, Delilah betrays him, he's captured by the Philistines, what happens? Well, they cut off his hair, symbolizing this kind of break in his relationship with the Lord. Even though the hair begins to regrow, what do? Well, the Philistines, they put out his eyes. So Samson now, no longer with the ability to see, can only what? Can only hear. And so Samson then, when he is, that element of his life is removed, that's then when Samson can pray to the Lord and to receive the power to actually do what he had been called to do all along, which was deliver the people of Israel from the oppression of the Philistines. But it only happened when his eyes had been put out and he had ears that heard the word of the Lord. I mean, that's just an interesting point for us to consider, as the old Jewish rabbis would have put it. But that for all of us, right, we want to be a people of the ears, right, who hear what God is saying, who then put it into practice in our lives. And not that we should be afraid of our eyes, right, and of seeing, but that we would have, like Jesus said, eyes that see and ears that hear, to know and bring everything in our lives under the authority and the auspices of God's kingdom. That's point number 2. So it brings us to the third point, right? Which is that the ultimate path to deliverance will require self-sacrifice. So as we see, Samson, the only thing that ultimately fulfilled his mission was when he was willing to sacrifice himself for the deliverance of the people, right? It says, like, the very last line that we read is that he killed many more when he died than while he lived, which is, of course, the point that the author is trying to make here, is that it was this self-sacrificial act that enabled Samson to fulfill his mission. Jesus makes this point repeatedly, right? He says, if you want to find your life, then you have to lose it. But if you lose your sake for my kingdom and for the gospel, then you really find it, right? And that's the kind of paradoxical way that you actually find life, is when you're willing to lay your life, your plans, your control down and receive God's life, his eternal kind of life into your life. And of course, the way that you receive that life is by hearing the word of the Lord and by putting it into practice. That's how Jesus taught it. He says, anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like someone who built his house on solid rock foundation. That no matter what storms may befall you in life, well, your house might get beaten up, but you'll still have a house at the end of the day. Why? Because you are living rooted in my kingdom. Remember what the kingdom of God is. It is God's reign, rule, and authority. It's where God's will is done. So as we submit ourselves under God's authority and live in a conversational relationship with him, which requires us talking and also us listening to God's voice, then we are able to experience the kind of life that he has for us. But that only comes when we lay our lives down. As a kind of tangential point to it, whatever mission you may have in your life, in some sense, it's going to require self-sacrifice. It's not going to be just you working harder or grinding away at whatever task has been set before you. It's when you really lay down your life and instead receive God's life in that place. So that's the third point. And then the last point, which I think is also very important for us to keep in mind, is that, like I said at the very beginning, right, all of us, I think in many ways as human beings, we have this innate longing for a perfect hero, for a genuine champion, which is why sometimes when people read through the biblical story, they can get disappointed when they hear that people like Abraham or Moses or Samson or David, or pick a biblical hero in the Old Testament, when they hear that these figures were not perfect, and that they had some very serious flaws. I mean, Abraham said that his wife was actually his sister and sold her into Pharaoh's harem. Moses murdered an Egyptian. Samson had a bit of an anger problem, maybe, did some kind of questionable things, and also definitely had some trouble with the old Philistine women, if you know what I mean. David committed adultery and had his adulteress, the husband of the woman that he had an affair with, he had him murdered in battle. And then, these are complicated figures and not at all good things. But we have this longing for a kind of perfect hero, don't we? That we want someone who's morally pure and excellent in every way. I mean, the ancient Greeks spoke about this idea. Someone who is morally excellent as well as physically excellent too. And yet, in all of our longing for this, and our looking and our searching and our striving, whether it's in literary figures or stories, or just in human life, we always seem to fall short, right? We don't find that person. We just can't seem to find the perfect hero. But of course, that is the culmination of the biblical narrative, is that there is one champion for human beings to look to. And the author of Hebrews, this sermon in the New Testament, he puts it like this. I think it's really good. He said, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, a faithful people, let us throw off everything that hinders us and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the champion and the perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." Because what we see in Jesus is this genuine perfect champion that we've been longing for, someone who will fight the battles of darkness and win, someone who understands that the road to deliverance and to freedom requires self-sacrifice, someone who is willing to sacrifice himself so completely, so fully, right? Scorning the shame of the cross, even, in order that all might be saved. In Jesus, we find someone who is willing to bring himself under the authority of the word of the Lord, to hear what God is speaking, who was obedient to God's word, and who himself was this representative of Israel as Israel's Messiah. Took on the mantle of representing this entire nation, but rather than being transformed by the world around him, and rather than falling prey to foreign women, as we see in the story of Samson, rather he was the transformative presence. And rather than being made unclean by people who came to him, rather he was the one who made people clean. He restored sight to the blind. He gave freedom to the captives. He set people free. He brought people back from the dead. He healed the sick. He brought transformation everywhere that he went. See, I think it's not a coincidence that so many of us, we find in ourselves this longing to have a perfect hero of the story. And when we look in the world around us, we're going to be disappointed. But that's why the invitation is for all of us to look to Jesus. To look to Jesus, the champion and the perfecter of our faith, and the one that we all long for at a very deep level, that heroic figure that we can look to and genuinely and truly worship, where our worship is rightly placed and rightly ordered. And so I just invite you to maybe consider how some of this might apply to your life, and then go and do it. Right? Go and do it. Have ears to hear and eyes to see. And I'd love to pray for you today as we wrap things up. Father, we thank you for your grace and your love, and I pray that everyone who's watching this video today, that they would know and experience your goodness and your faithfulness, that they would look to Jesus as the champion and the perfecter of their faith, and know that as they come to him and they live in relationship with him, that he sorts out all the other stuff. As long as they keep coming to him and seeking him and pursuing him and fixing their mind and their eyes and their heart and their ears on him and his story. And so we just bless you and praise you and worship you, Lord, for that gift that you've given us and for who you are and how you live in our lives, and what you do in us and through us. And we pray that you would help us to be that transformative presence in our world, to live in that intermediary space between darkness and light, and to bring the light forward, to send all darkness fleeing. We bless you and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Well, I'd love to hear from you. If you got any questions, comments, concerns, reach out and let us know. You can find all of the links that you might need in the post below. Giving, connection, any of those things. Please do, if you haven't subscribed to this video, share with a friend who might like it. We'd love to help as many people as we can. So thanks. Know that I'm praying for you. Y'all have a great day, make a great week, and we will catch you next time.